I just want to say hello. My name is Kasha Samel. I'm the American Indian Resource Center librarian with LA County Library. Before we begin tonight's program and introduce our speakers, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our American Indian Resource Center. We're located in Huntington Park Library and was established in 1979 to address informational needs of American Indians and Alaska Natives in Los Angeles County, and also to make information about them available to the larger community. You can find a variety of materials in our collection. We have newspapers such as the Navajo Times, Fort Apache, and Lakota Times. We also have books on various tribal nations from California to across the East Coast and all over, and even movies and music CDs, as well as a children's collection. We host events and lectures and provide reference services about culture and issues pertaining to American Indians and Alaska Natives. You can learn more about these resources by visiting our website, lacountylibrary.org, which we'll drop into the chat. Now I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to tonight's speakers. Leading tonight's conversation is our very own Library Director, Sky Patrick. Sky Patrick was appointed LA County Library Director in 2016. In her role, she is responsible for library's 85 libraries, 18 vehicle mobile fleet, which is huge, and resources that are used by more than 3.4 million customers across LA County. Sky is committed to breaking down barriers and increasing access for all. In addition to helping LA County Library go fine free and initiating several other services to help provide more access and opportunity for customers, Sky launched the library's iCount Equity Initiative. The library's iCount Equity Initiative ensures that library services and programs address the needs of the diverse communities across LA County. Sky continues to reinforce the library's role in the community as a civic and cultural center, a hub for public information, services, and discourse, and an institution of literacy, innovation, and lifelong learning. Tonight, Sky will be interviewing author and poet Shonda Buchanan. Shonda is the author of 5 books, including the award-winning memoir Black Indian, which was chosen by PBS NewsHour as a top 20 books to read to learn about institutional racism. Shonda is a descendant of African nations, Coharie, Choctaw, and Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and Europeans. She is a Pushcart Prize nominee, Oxfam Ambassador, USC Los Angeles Institute for the Humanities Fellow, and City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs Master Artist Fellow. In addition to her career as a writer, Shonda is also the newest fiction faculty member in Alma College's MFA program. Welcome, Shonda. Sky will now hand the program over to you.
Thank you, Akasha, for that introduction, and thank you, Shonda, for joining us. I'm wanting to call you Dr. Buchanan, though you state very clearly that this is not academic. Oh, you can't even see the book. There it is.
But that's okay. I do have my MFA, which is a terminal degree.
Which is terminal. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So before we get started, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight. I'm really thrilled to be able to present this conversation with Shonda this evening. But before we get started, I'd like to take an opportunity to do a land acknowledgement. Most of you in Los Angeles County know that the County Board of Supervisors provided a directive for all county agencies, all county departments and programs to begin our programs with the land acknowledgement and efforts to be very intentional about whose land that we share in this space and time. So let's see, Jessica has put it on the screen. The County of Los Angeles recognizes that we occupied land originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Choctaw, Serrano, Quiche, and Chumash people. We honor and pay respects to their elders, descendants, past and present, and emerging, as they continue their stewardship of these lands and waters. We acknowledge that settler colonialization resulted in land seizure, disease, subjugation, slavery, relocation, broken promises, genocide, and multi-generational trauma. This acknowledgement demonstrates our responsibility and commitment to truth, healing, reconciliation, and to elevating the stories, culture, and community of the original inhabitants of Los Angeles County. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these ancestral lands. We are dedicated to growing and sustaining relationships with Native peoples and local tribal governments, including, in no particular order, the Fernandino Toctavian Band of Mission Indians, the Gabrielino Tongva Indians of California Tribal Council, the Gabrielino Tongva San Gabriel Band of Mission Indians, the Gabrielino Band of Mission Indians Quiche Nation, the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, and the San Fernando Band of Mission Indians. Okay. So once again, Shonda, thank you for joining us. These talks are hand and heart conversations, and really what it is meant to be is a conversation, a discourse, help provide another point of view for some of our customers and users about things that they may have interest in, things they may not know anything about. And you would, as our guest, will serve as an introduction. So let me start by saying I'm from Michigan.
Where are you from, Sky?
I'm from Lansing.
Oh, my auntie lives there, yes.
Yes, you actually look like people in my family, but we can have that conversation another day. So this book was really interesting to me because it was located in an area of the country that I'm familiar with, and it was also a pleasure to recall some of the names of the tribal folks back in the Middle West, like the Ojibwa, as you mentioned, as one example. We have a lot of questions for you, and I want to make sure that I reserve some time for our participants to ask you questions. They have them in the chat. I'm not sure if you can see them, Shonda, but if you can't, we'll make sure that we get to as many as possible. So let's start with, if you could just help familiarize our audience with this concept of a Black Indian community. I know in other times and spaces you've called it Red Black. If you could share with us like what that means and kind of give a general overview of that.
I can. So first of all, may I begin with a song, if that's okay? Just a brief song, because when I do
yes, ma'am,
talks like this, I like to give the song. We say in our circles, singing is praying twice. And I want to honor our ancestors of these lands, and then also the ancestral lands of which I was born. And I was born with the ancestors of the Anishinaabe, or Chippewa, Odawa nations, or Ottawa. And so I wanted to sing a song that I learned from an Anishinaabe man. His name was Bob Jondro. And when I was singing on his drum, this is the Eagle Calling song that he taught us on his American Indian drum, just in honor of Bob. And so I'll just do a quick little quick part of it, and then I'll answer your question. So that's
thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for allowing me to do that. That's an Eagle Calling song. And I think to your first question, and I'm going to ask you to repeat it, so I want to make sure that I am answering the question specifically. What was that first question?
Sure. So first of all, can you hear me? Because my screen is doing something a little wackadoo. Okay, great. So the question was really to kind of center this idea of the Black Indian community and what that means. I'm wondering how many folks who are listening right now actually know what that means. And again, I mentioned that in other interviews and things, you've called it like the red black. And so I was hoping that you could kind of expound on that.
Absolutely. So now I can segue from the song. So what a Black Indian is, or an Afro-Indigenous person, or an African-American who honors their American Indian ancestry, ultimately, there are three ways that we can come to that. Either our ancestors who we have traced back 11, 12, 13 generations, have on records, and I'll talk a little bit more about that too with regards to my research, but they have on their records, they're listed as Indian, or we know that particular tribe that our family was related to, or they lived on that reservation, which ultimately usually means that you are either you were married into the tribe, so then you likely would be having children of that tribe. If your African American and American Indian ancestor did marry, then you are an offspring of that tribe or that nation. So you have that American Indian blood. And then also another way is you could be adopted into a tribe. And traditionally, when you are adopted into a tribe, that means you have the rights of the tribal community. And so we can kind of look historically at, particularly with my people, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my my Staffords. So my mom was a Stafford, her father, my grandfather, was a Stafford, and my great-grandfather was the youngest child of 13 children who were the children of my great-great-grandfather, who was born in North Carolina in 17, actually the 1817, between the 1700s, 1850, I'm so sorry, Jeremiah Stafford Sr. And Jeremiah Stafford Sr. is mentioned on his records as a mulatto. In some places, he's mentioned as Indian. In other places, he's also mentioned in a couple of places as being one of the migrants of mixed race people who were American Indian, African American, and European, who migrated to the Michigan area, which is where I was born and raised. But Malcolm X has a saying that just because you put forgive me for those who this might not be a saying that you've heard before, but you can put a cat in the oven, but it doesn't come out a biscuit, right? Whatever you are when you enter a place, you are that person when you are migrating, when you are traveling, right? The blood of the people still exists within you. So one of the things that I did was, when I knew my oral history growing up in Kalamazoo, Michigan, the oral history from my mom and my aunts was that you have some French in you, some German, and the way that we said it was, we said Indian. We didn't say American Indian, Native American. We didn't say it like that. We said Indian. And my mom would say, you have a little bit of Black. And when I was 17, I decided, I said, who are these tribes? Like, where are our American Indian ancestors? No one is talking about that. No one in my family knows exactly who those American Indians are. So I set myself on the path to find them, and recovering the traditions in the form of the song that I sang is such a gratifying moment for me to be able to share that song with you.
Thank you so much for that. I have so many like tributaries I want to go off on, but I'm going to try and stay focused here. So you talk a little bit about your family, the Stafford family, and you've already mentioned that you can go as far back as the 1850s and 1860s of your grandfather in North Carolina. Can you talk a little bit about that family, about this family, and even how, I'm really curious at what you did to be able to discover your family. So if someone is of African descent and Native Indigenous descent, we know that records were poorly kept. Can you talk a little bit about that and like how you discovered your family?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, it's a bit of a travesty that we don't have records that that show that particular lineage from where we are now into the beginning where the first 20 enslaved Angolans came to Jamestown, right, in 1619, right? So people have records. They just didn't care to keep the records of enslaved peoples unless you were listed as property, or unless you were listed as a sometimes a mulatto person who you happen to be the offspring of this enslaved master, and then a black woman who was his property. So it's a real travesty that we don't have that. And I will tell you that it has been a meticulous process for me, really pulling together the threads of history and laser focusing on a particular family branch. So one of the things that I'm actually doing right now, so my book, Black Indian, this memoir, is a family story. It is a national story. It's the tapestry, actually, of America, and it's very much a personal story. And I did trace that ancestry from the records in county registrar's offices. So I would take the ancestor that I knew, the eldest ancestor that I knew. So for example, my grandfather, and then I would plug him into, say, for example, an ancestry.com or a familysearch.org. I'd find out when he died, when he was born, who his people were, where they were born, when they died, and then I would keep going back and back and back and back. It was a very meticulous process to try to keep all this information together, because sometimes the information changed. And then I would cross-reference what I found there with county records. So for example, North Carolina, Virginia, all the first 13 colonies have started keeping track of information in the 1790s, which is when the census was first orchestrated. And they were keeping track, from my understanding, particularly because of property reasons or property issues. So for example, who lived there, what did they own, how many cows, sheep, cattle, those kinds of things, like what they owned. And then also it became, of course, who they owned, right? So it was kind of like that property, who was in the house, who was in the home. So you can cross-reference the information from the 1790s to into 1800s, 1810, 1820, et cetera. When I was looking for one of my ancestors on the manual side, which is my mom's people, I found a grandfather, and it was fascinating to me. I found his name, birth date, where he was born. I cross-referenced that with the information in the county registrars. Then I cross-referenced it on his Social Security card, and then I cross-referenced it with his war registration card, World War II registration card. And he evolved on the race line from being Indian to being mulatto to being colored, and then eventually white. And when I laid all of that next to each other, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is how it happened. We have the ability, and I'm going to try to stay with the question of how did I do that research. So we have the ability. It takes a lot of time. We have the ability to find those people for the most part. And then you can go to the National Archives, which in DC, I also went to the National Archives. In North Carolina, I went to the county registrars. There's a genealogy library in North Carolina, which is incredibly helpful, and a genealogy library in Hampton, Virginia, which is helpful as well. And you can also go to the headquarters of the Church of Latter-day Saints in your particular communities, in your cities and wherever they're located, and they usually have a specific genealogy room as well. But I have to say that looking at the evolution of that grandfather, third, fourth great grandfather, and his ethnic evolution, and I was thinking, why did he have to do that? Why did he have to go from being one ethnicity, one particular race or tribe, only listed as Indian, not listed as his Coharie, the Coharie nation that he was from, and then in changing his racial ethnic makeup every 10 years. And when I was looking at that history, I was like, oh, it's because of being ostracized or being persecuted as a either mixed race person or as someone who could be mixed race, but you presented as African American only, or you were considered a free person of color. In the 1700s and 1800s, you could be a free person of color, which would mean that you were mixed or you were Black and you had never owned, so sorry, my apologies, you had never been enslaved, or you could say you bought yourself out of enslavement. Sometimes free people of color would own their own relatives as slaves to keep them out of chattel slavery. So, I mean, it's such an interesting just journey to really trace and pull together the strings and to create an actual family web. And what I just told you is just maybe a thumbnail sketch of the kinds of information that you can find once you really put your mind to it. Something else that I say when I give a genealogy workshop, and I have one coming up in April, but I usually tell people, before you do any of the other research, who are the oldest people in your family who are still alive? Rush to interview them. Ask them everything they know about the past, about where they were born, about people that they remember, cousins, aunties, uncles, brothers. Ask them everything. And then that way you have that information, that oral history, that oral narrative, and you can cross-reference information when you finally get in the weeds, as we call it, or when you get to the documents.
That's fascinating. And it's really interesting as an artist to hear you really leverage information, the documentality, archives, and that you've figured out a pathway to the ultimate end. And so I think one thing that was particularly interesting that I heard that I hadn't thought of before, but when you said it, Shonda, it made complete sense. Church and faith-based records, of course, you know, of course, it made sense when you said it, but I hadn't thought of it. And then, of course, places like the Registrar Recorder and places that you would obviously look, National Archives and things like that. It's also very interesting, you know, your statement about your grandfather essentially changing race over decades and just understanding systems of oppression and how they operated even at that time. And so, you know, of course, it would make a lot of sense that if he had the ability to pass, that he would choose that way in order to be free. So, you know, I take that and I kind of hold it and sit with it and understand that the reasons why someone would make a decision like that who may not feel compelled to do so today.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm so sorry, you were going to ask another question. I didn't mean to interrupt, but it's
no, by all means, go ahead. This is a conversation.
Yeah, no, in terms of the passing piece of it and ownership, or rather denying your mixed raciality, I really there are reasons definitely that the passing for another ethnic group or passing for white will make your life easier. But also there were moments even in American Indian nations or tribes, where because the federal government said to them, because the federal government was afraid that they couldn't tell who was who at the time. And when American Indians were creating Indian schools and for themselves and on their tribal lands, federal government came in and said, if you have anybody of Black blood in your schools, they need to be ejected or we will not give you federal funding. And so this happened, of course, in the Southeast. My people are from the North Carolina, Virginia area. The Coharie, there is a document for the Coharie people, which are my manuals people. And the document states, it's a verbal confirmation of some of the elders of that tribe that we have no Negro blood, but they did. So it's such that denying of your race or raciality part because of the benefits that that you can hopefully get or glean with regards to land allotment or an education over, as an American Indian, over African Americans was definitely a moment of division in our country. So, I mean, I give my ancestors grace when I see that they are listed themselves as mixed race, or because they were, or if they've disappeared into white society. I give them grace because I understand how institutional racism worked.
Absolutely. And I just want to take an opportunity to clarify something you said a little bit earlier, just about the freed Black folks, the freed Negroes, I think is, or freed people of color. So there was a time where there were those delineations of race and culture. And then there was a moment when all of that changed and everyone of color just became colored. And so I think I think that you're just bringing that up. I think it's kind of important to understand that. I wonder what the relationality is there with your grandfather moving through time and through the decades, and whether or not that was like, you know, part of just the society that he lived in and what was changing, what was deemed acceptable, and maybe perhaps him moving into whiteness, not only for its benefits, but its protection once it became us and them. So a little bit of a tiny bit of a shift here. You know, we have to talk about trauma. You kind of already bring it up in some ways. And I think that this is a great opportunity where you talk about like the women in your family and the trauma that they've endured. How would you connect the circles of violence and abuse and addiction, having both Black ancestry, African ancestry, and Indigenous ancestry?
So there was a moment when I was researching my book, Black Indian, and I can't remember exactly the year, but I was researching it, and it came to me like a watershed that I have African ancestors who were enslaved, who came from Africa and experienced trauma. And then I have American Indian ancestors and possibly those indentured servants as well. I have indentured European servants, but those American Indian, Native American ancestors who were put on the Trail of Tears, who were related to people who were on the Trail of Tears, which is the Trail of Tears is when they removed the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cree, and Seminole from the southeastern part of the state. And they, put them on a trail, put them on a journey, pushing them literally off their homelands. And this is between 1828 and 1832, but it was enacted as the Indian Removal Act in 1830. And so the government sent a warning to the tribes to say, we're going to remove you, we're going to remove you. And if you don't leave, then we're going to remove you. And my people had already gotten on the trail. They read the winds, they could hear like what was happening, and they knew it was like there's free people of color are being their rights are being taken away from them. Let's get on the Appalachian Trail or the King's Highway Trail. But for those 5 civilized tribes, if they had not left when the government said you should leave, the army came in and collected them. No matter what they were doing, they could be cooking, they could be washing clothes, on the river, put them on that trail and march them from the southeast into Oklahoma and Alabama. So Oklahoma and Alabama is known as Indian Territory because that's where they were trying to squash all the American Indians, over 500 nations, that they could actually find. So, I mean, that's a travesty in our history. And when I was writing that, my memoir, and I had that moment, that watershed moment, that this trauma is real. It's an inherited trauma in our DNA. It is a trauma that is prevalent. I'm an educator. I work at Loyola Marymount University and also Alma College's MFA program. But it is something that we have inherited in our cultural systems, in our beliefs about race and raciality, beliefs about other people, in our healthcare, in our, the trauma from that, the moments where the disruption happened and the relocation, which I also call the dislocation, right? It's almost like a bone just like pops out. And if you are moving people from their tribal homelands, then there is a serious loss, And so I feel like the women in my family, and I write about this in the book, more so my women than the men, but I do talk about my nephew. And I feel like we inherited that and enacted that in these kinds of ways: addiction, abuse, forgetfulness. Toni Morrison calls it a non-memory, right? You are not remembering the memory. It's a non-memory. So we just basically left stuff behind on the trail, I call it. And when we finally got to me, I was born in 1968. When you got to me, you have lost so much. And it's like, but mommy, this is me when I want something, I call my mom, mommy, do you know our tribes? No, I don't know. I don't know any of that. You ask too many questions, girl. And so I can't ask my grandfather because my grandfather is an alcoholic and he's pretty violent. And it's just like, he's one of those gruff bear people who, you don't want to ask questions of. And plus my grandpa would carry a pistol around in case, he needed to use it. And then so no one had that history. The one thing that I was really grateful for, I don't think I cried, but maybe I feel like I did cry when my aunt gave me a genealogy chart that my great aunt did, my great aunt Catherine. And she said she listed all the people because she wanted us to know what health issues we had in the family that we had died from. But it was a treasure trove for me. When I saw that people were just like, she listed their nations, like one of my great greats is listed on the chart as Pequot and Delaware Cherokee, and then one of them is listed as Nusiuk, and the Nusiuk are actually a band of American Indians in the North Carolina area that rolled into the Coharie tribe. So it was a treasure trove for me, but I'm the writer, I'm the researcher, and now I can see, like, oh, that's why my family is the way we are, because we don't know who we are. We don't have those connections to our African ancestors. We don't have those connections to our American Indian ancestors. And I always say that none of the Europeans showed up to the family reunions in like kilts, or anything. So who are you and where are you? And that's actually, I want to write probably a little novella or something about on my white ancestors trail. But the African ancestors too, we don't know. My DNA says a percentage Nigerian, percentage Senegambian, percentage Congolese. But who are they? I don't have any of those languages, right? I didn't inherit it. So we inherited trauma.
You remind me of a book that I've just recently finished by Catherine McKitteridge, and it's called Dear Science and Other Stories. And she talks about this very thing that you're speaking of, about this idea of generational trauma through forced migration. Similar to what you're talking about in this idea of dispossession and how it shows up in your life in all of these different ways, isms, as we might also coin. And just like, how does one begin to decouple ourselves from our historical trauma is, I think, probably the feat of our lifetime.
Well, that's why I'm a writer. That's why I write.
That's why you're right. I think I've heard that one too, a lot, and that's probably why you sing and why you dance and all the ways in which you express yourself artistically, to save yourself from yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, poetry has always been a way for me to be able to define myself outside of how society has defined me, outside of questions that people have asked me all my life. What are you mixed with? And so how do you answer that question that you've been asked 50 times, 100 times? And so sometimes I answer how my mom did. My mom was like, I'm mixed with human, I'm human, And then I would say I'm mixed with my mother and my father, And so, how do you, how do you deal with that kind of the onslaught of questioning who you are based off of how you look visibly? And so I just started just writing. I had to write specific moments and episodes and really also I wanted to tell the story of Michiganders and free people of color who did suffer from racism. And there is the quietest kept knowledge of the KKK in the Midwestern area.
Right.
But then we're also mixed too. So there are some people who know that your great grandfather, or that grandfather is a mulatto, is a mixed race person, but we have to relegate him to the color of the Negro's face.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I don't think this is a Michigan thing, but maybe it is, where my family has always said that we have Indian in us, and I quote, and I hope that's not meant to be despairing, but it is just how it was said. And what I kind of chuckle at when you say about Michiganders, first of all, you said Michiganders, and I know what you mean. But secondly, that, we have this idea of who we are and where we come from. But at the same time, we're not necessarily in a position to talk about it in any sort of real and deliberate way. And so, I think about this, and I think about the conversations I've had with my family about where we come from. And your point is well taken about speaking to elders and like getting the stories, writing it down or recording them like while they're here. One of the things that I have found really difficult in that conversation is like, how do you approach it? Because of the historical trauma and, think sometimes, you have the right to forget, as my dear friend, Dr. Sophia Noble says, often that is your right to be able to disappear or forget. So how did you get your family to talk about this, to talk about your history?
Yeah, I think it is a truism that you have the right to forget. You have the right not to talk about your trauma. You have the right to not talk about things that you don't want to talk about. And my great Aunt Catherine literally said that to me when I went home for a funeral. I was probably halfway through the book. And it was my great Aunt Phyllis's funeral, which I actually opened the book up with. And after the funeral, I called my great aunt and I said, Aunt Catherine, I've been telling the family, I'm writing a book about the family. It's the good and the bad. I'm talking about, experiences that I have had. I'm talking, and I actually didn't even say I'm talking about race or raciality. It was like, I'm talking about where we come from, etc. And she said to me, I'm not going to talk to you about my family. And I thought, oh, and I was like taken aback. Like, I thought everyone would want to talk. And she didn't want to talk. And I knew why. My great Aunt Catherine could pass. She was listed as the first secretary first mulatto or colored secretary in Kalamazoo. She could pass, but she didn't. So she was kind of from the quote unquote upper upper society of colored people at that time. So why would she want to share the history of her Black side or her indigenous Indian side when she could actually pass? Also, I remember specific moments where of her intra-racism. Intra-racism, for those who do not know, is when people of color are derogatory and racist to family members, or within your own family, or within your own race. And my aunt, there were times when we would go to her house and she would not let us in her house because we were the darker skinned Indians. We were the darker skinned kids. And there was something about us that she just did not sit with. She just could not sit with. So I remember those moments. But I also think at the same time, she never married, never had kids, could never pass on like her actual blood lineage to anyone. And at the same time, there were things that maybe her father told her or her mother told her. And there were things that happened with her mother that I now know because I kept asking those questions. And so I dropped it. I never asked her anything again, but I continually kept researching. My mom, when I told my mom that I'm writing a book about the family, I want to know what happened to you in your childhood. And my mom had a traumatic childhood, growing up with her dad, her alcoholic father, who was also a philanderer. And what we say is that she got all the whippings for the rest of the kids in the family. So it was hard for her to talk about it, but it was a narrative that I had heard all of my life. Whenever someone would say, "What was it like, Mama, growing up?" And she would basically just tell us what it was like. And so I grew up knowing she had a hard life. And when I finally approached her to say that, she was like, "Okay, well, fine, that's okay, that's good." And basically it was like, "Okay, sure, write the story." And when I gave her the manuscript, before I even had a publisher, I gave my mom the manuscript, I gave my aunt the manuscript, and I said, "Mommy, I want you to read this." Read it. So, because I didn't want any super blowback. I didn't want her to disown me and tell me never to come in her house. And so she took it in her room. I literally remember, she probably will say, "I don't remember doing that, Shonda." But she took the book in her room, and a day later, she came back and said, "You spelled your Aunt Catherine's name wrong." And that's all she told me. That was it. That was all she said. And I realized later, so I'm telling my story from my perspective of what it was like growing up in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and my grandfather's farm was in Mattawan, Michigan. So we're kind of on the periphery, from a family that inherited trauma, from a mother who had a traumatic childhood of abuse. And I realized at a certain point that she wanted her story to be told. She wanted someone to testify to what had happened, to her. And maybe she didn't think about all the history part of it. And she didn't think about it like the way that I was thinking of it in terms of lineage and inheritance and heritage. But she really wanted her story to be told. And she carries my book around now. She carries it on, wherever she goes, in her car, if she's on the bus, and she's like, "My daughter wrote this book. My daughter wrote this book." She was proud. Other family members basically were saying, don't, one of my relatives said, "If you accept any money from this book, that's blood money. And don't write this book." And I thought, I'll help you write your own book, but I'm still going to write my book. If you have a book that you'd like to write, I will help you. But I'm still going to tell my family story because I needed to make sense of it. And the making sense of it became the uncovering and the discovery and the unearthing of what had occurred over a period of I can go back to, what's that, 500 years, 400 years, over 500 American Indian nations, in terms of the Africans who were enslaved here, that history as well. And so I felt like I was telling that story, in some parts tangentially, and then in other parts very specifically.
Yeah, there's so many things I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about colorism. I want to talk to you about your daughter and what the impact of your releasing this family, familial lineage and familial history, how that impacts her. I have so many questions, but I have to wrap up so that I can allow our guests to ask you questions. But I can sit here with you for another hour, and maybe we'll do a part 2.
Yes, let's do a part 2. I'm happy to do that.
You know, there's so many questions I want to ask you about mental health too, especially as it pertains to Black and Indigenous bodied people. Let me ask you this, because we are the library. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you 2 questions. 1, what's your next project? And 2, what are you reading?
Oh my gosh. Okay, so thank you for asking those questions. I have 3 projects that I'm going to mention. I'm working on a collection of poetry about in what we call the settlers, quote unquote, of the Los Angeles Basin area. But literally, they weren't settlers. They were pilgrims who came to a land where there were already indigenous people. So they came to the Alvaro Street area, the Tongva area. But there's also the story that I want to tell of the Keech, the Tongva. But there's also Tehachapi, the Tule River, Indians. So we have to remember that there were more tribes than the Chumash and Tongva. So that's a project. I'm also working on a second memoir, which is about relationships and spirituality and travel. So it's kind of my Black woman's Eat, Pray, Love meets how I became Indian. So how I recovered my traditions and my heritage, and just kind of really delving into how it helped my mental health in a lot of ways. The other project is I'm actually tracing with my documentation the 6 branches of my family, and I want to look at it's such a, so when this book, my memoir, Black Indian, came out, my editor said, you have to take out all that history. She's like, it's a narrative, you've got 75 pages of history. So I'm going to put that into another book. And yes, and really look at the Staffords, the Manuels, the Curtises, the Roberts, who started some of the first free people of color settlements in Indiana. And so, and then one of my Roberts started some of the first free people of color settlements in the Michigan area. So I come from a family of migration people, and then also settlers. So those are 3 books. Yes, those are 3 books.
just a few projects.
It's a lot. Oh, thank you. Somebody said they're getting chills. Yes. Because I want to codify the history of Black Indians. I really, really want to pull together one of my projects that I've been working with too is an encyclopedia of Black Indians, and so that way I get to talk about a Coretta Scott King, who's got her American Indian her, and then Jesse Jackson and Mildred Loving, and so I get to literally kind of talk about encampments, and so people who call that have that identity for themselves. Okay. What am I reading? I just got a book called The History of Black Indians in the United States. I am rereading William Loren Katz's book called Black Indians, which was published in 1986. And I actually talked to him before he passed, and he was such a kind, white man, a historian, who was he was like, yeah, he said, I just kept researching Black cowboys and came upon the Black Indian connection, and I really wanted to give that back to people of color. And so it was just a gorgeous book. Also, the last book that I will mention, and Heyday Press will love this, because Heyday is
We're familiar.
I'm sorry?
We're familiar. I am anyway. Go ahead.
They published the memoir of the first Indigenous woman to become a Peace Corps volunteer, and so I'm reading her book right now. So that's a little bit of what I'm reading.
I love it. And Yeah, it's interesting. Just so that you know, just a week or two ago, we had a program at our Compton location about Black cowboys and the history of Black cowboys and cowgirls, cow people here in Southern California. So fascinating program. And I had no idea that it was such a predominant community. I have to get to some of these questions, Shonda.
Okay.
So here's one from one of our participants. My grandmother was born in Arcadia, Louisiana on an Indian reservation. And I was told by my mother that since she was African-American descent, that as a child, he had to leave the reservation. I wonder if there's anyone else with similar stories. And I think you mentioned that already, but do you want to say anything else to that?
Sure. So in the Louisiana area, so you actually don't know, because it could be anywhere between the Seminole and just Creole, right? So you can say the Creole a name as well. In terms of people who had to leave the reservation, he would have left with his parents or some other relatives. And if he had to leave, that means a couple of things: that either there were government officials who were kind of in the business of the tribe, and so kind of like pushing people who looked dark skinned out of the tribe. So maybe they left because of that. So when you say he had to leave, that's one of the things I think of, is how his family could have been forced off because they were darker skinned Indians. So that's one reason. And then another reason too is you don't know if he was listed as an enslaved person. So if he was listed as an enslaved person, when you say he had to leave, was he transferred to another plantation? So, I mean, those are just some historical contexts that we have to think about when we realize that our people have left a reservation. And then other people just, my people particularly, they were like, we don't want to do this anymore with regards to the counting of who owns who, or the erasure, right? Because they were being erased. American Indians, they were just losing. And so we were like, we need to pack up and get on the trail and find a better place where we can be left alone. And so my people did. From the North Carolina area, they went to Tennessee, not welcome. Kentucky, not welcome. Some people in Ohio, there were actually states where they had to pay a tax on themselves to be in that state.
Absolutely.
So, not welcome. And so my people just kept moving until Indiana.
That's where the colloquialism, black taxes, come from. Let me get to a couple more of these questions before we move on. So this one I think is interesting. She says, Ms. Buchanan, can you speak a little about the indigenous view of kinship before Europeans' invention of race? I would be remiss not to mention another book called The Invention of White People, I think is what it's called, by Nell Irvin Painter. By all means, what's your thought on that?
Yeah. So in terms of the invention of kinship, when I think of the word kinship, I do think of people who are blood related. And I also think about people who were adopted or who created family because of the trauma. That's what I think of when I think of the word kinship. So for example, remember how we used to say play cousins? Like, that's my play cousin over there. Or my mom actually just said this to me. She said, well, they weren't really cousins, but we called them cousins because we lived next door to each other. And so you had to create family or kinship in order to survive, in order to protect each other, trade with each other, give each other what they needed. And of course, intermarrying happened where then you would actually be cousins. So.
Yeah, and I would argue that there are still communities who really create their own families, LGBTQ families as an example, because you need each other to survive. So I think that's still relevant and prevalent at this point in time. Here's another great question. I had the same revelation as you, Ms. Buchanan, growing up multiracial, including Blackfoot Indian and African ancestry. It hit me in the middle of school that my roots represent pain and struggle. With that being said, how do you stay level-headed?
So I'm so glad you asked that question. For me as a writer, the thing that I am aiming for in my poetry, in my memoir, in my fiction, I'm aiming for the redemption. I'm aiming to find the resilience.
Beautiful.
I'm aiming to write towards what was beautiful, and definitely the sense of kinship, definitely the stories of mothers and daughters or siblings or sisters, you know, sisterhood. But I'm looking for how can I make this story that is something that is filtering as a ghost in my head, in my psyche, and mention and talk about those painful parts, but then how do I show the beauty? And so I'm always looking for that. And so that's one of the ways that I deal with that. And then also making sure that people know the history to the best of my ability.
I have to ask this last question, but before I do, this book is fascinating. I hope you can see it. It's not showing up very well with my background. Black Indian, a memoir by Shonda Buchanan. Buy it. If you cannot buy it, check it out from the public library. We have many copies. This one I think is a great question to end on. And this one says, how do you approach participating in Native American spaces in person or online, being Black or mixed? Sometimes I don't feel like I can speak or participate authentically since I'm not visible, since I visibly present as Black and don't look Native. And I did not grow up on a reservation. I think that's a great question. What are your thoughts on that?
No, that's a fantastic question. So I did not grow up on a reservation either. I grew up very country in Michigan, and for me, it was like the Mattawan, the farmers, the farm area. I'm the granddaughter of farmers and settlers. So when I talk about that second book and how I became or how I reclaimed the traditions, when I said I set myself at 17, I wrote to myself in a journal entry, where are those American Indian ancestors? I want to find them. That's 17. Fast forward maybe fast forward probably about 8 to 10 years. And this is when I started going to the genealogy library in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Fast forward I'm fast forwarding my story, another 10 years, and a friend of mine took me to an American Indian sweat lodge. When I got there, I realized that I had found my home. I had found what I was looking for. I grew up in and out of my dad's Baptist church, and I was never like satisfied with church and with the whole. I love gospel music and I love the message of God, but I was never comfortable in that square space. And the sweat lodge became a place that I was comfortable. But this is what I did. I was quiet for 5 years. Like literally, I was paying attention. I was learning songs. I was learning how you're supposed to communicate, because I didn't have any of that, right? I came from a really loud family. And so when I started going to the sweat lodge, I was there for, my gosh, going to that particular sweat lodge in the mountains of California with other intertribal people. And then I got a job at Hampton University in 2004, and then I started participating in American Indian powwows, singing on drums. But I know what she's asking, or what the person is asking is, how did you do it? And my first thing is, if you know where your people are from, find the powwow, go to the powwow and just start politely asking about people who are with your last name. Tell people who your last name, what your last name is, or your last names in that area. And usually somebody who's a vendor or someone who's dancing will know your people or know of your people. I mean, literally, blood calls blood. I always say, this has happened to me several times. So that's one way to do it, is to go to the powwow in those areas. And then the other piece is you could start attending you could actually Google Black Indians, because they're Black Indians or Afro-Indigenous people are having events all over the country. In Virginia, if anyone is in the Virginia area, the Wyanoke Association educates people on Black Indian intersections, and they are just good friends of mine. I was on that board for a little while, but really it's showing up. it's showing up in the places, in the spaces, in the states, in the cities. And if they allow that on the reservations and just kind of talking to people and saying, this is who my people are, you know, do you know anybody? I'm talking a lot, sorry.
No, again, I wish I could keep going. So showing up with intentionality, that's what I hear, with respect, humility, and intentionality. Once again, we have, so bad, so sorry, you're disappearing. Can you show your own book? There we are. Black Indian by Shonda Buchanan. Thank you so much for joining us. I've had such a great time with you. I do think we need to do this again because I have part 2 questions.
Okay.
But maybe I'll wait until one of your new projects come out.
Thank you so much, guys.
We want to thank everyone for joining us. These are incredible questions. I wish that we had some way of getting the answers for you. I want to thank Kasha and our American Indian Resource Center here at the LA County Library, and we will see you real soon.